Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Today's episode features a conversation I had on the winter solstice with Don DeBar. Don is senior producer of CPR News, a daily 30-minute radio news program that is available on numerous radio stations and also at cprnews.podbean.com. Don is a frequent guest on RT Television and Press TV and other media other than the U.S. mainstream media, of course. I had intended to talk to Don about the recent revelations on Russian interference in U.S. social media during the 2016 campaign, but current events seemed more pressing. With Trump suddenly deciding to remove U.S. troops from Syria and Afghanistan and Mad Dog Mattis resigning as defense secretary in a huff, it seemed more prudent to start there. The mainstream media is viewing this all as a great gift to Russia's Vladimir Putin. I asked Don for his insights into that question and what is going on in Washington.
For the same reasons that they, since 1917 really, demonized the Soviet Union. They're demonizing Russia now. It's in service to some policy that requires that kind of political propaganda cover, because on the merits, it's not something that people would see as being in their interests and something that should be pursued, particularly given the expense. I mean, if you think about what it took to kill socialism in the Soviet Union over 80 years, required, in essence, the construction of a global military empire surrounding the Soviet Union and China, which, they started building pretty much simultaneously. In 1917, at the end of World War I, the U.S. had some far-flung territories like the Philippines, but, Hawaii, like that, but nothing approaching what they ended up with by the end of World War II. And then what was constructed after that, somebody's paying for this. And people, it's not the kind of thing that's subtle where you can gradually, say, use inflation or something so that people feel like they're engaged in the economy fairly, that they're holding their own. And maybe every 10 years or so, there's like 2 less French fries in their trip to McDonald's on Wednesday or whatever. It's noticed. And so therefore, the policy has to be part of a public narrative or masked in other ways. And so it's a focal point of, a great deal of propaganda. Why on earth would you have, as a peace-loving democratic nation, the envy of the world? Why would you need to have the biggest, baddest, most far-flung military on hair-trigger alert all the time? Because of the Russians, because of communists, because of this, because of that. Same thing driving the narratives.
Well, Don, you talk about the bite that the military takes out of the taxpayers, and that's absolutely true. But I mean, I think on the other side, we have to realize that in our system, particularly, there is a tremendous amount of money to be made. We're selling these weapons, and if we had no big enemy on the horizon, there's some corporations like Boeing and McDonnell Douglas and others that would make a lot less money.
This really. I would say I'll use the word disappointing to me, only because we're talking about another member of our species, and what disappoints me is that it reflects that our species can sink this low. But Michael Moore with Canadian Bacon illustrated, in fine detail exactly what you're talking about. Showing how with the peace dividend that we never actually got, but with the the threat of the peace dividend, that the economy that had been built on militarism would start to contract, and that there'd be political fallout from that, etc. And he showed all of that in a way that showed the need to drive it by the president affirmatively looking for somebody to declare an enemy so they can start buying weapons again and goose the economy. He understood that really, really well in the 1990s when he made that movie. And he is now one of the worst, most shrill advocates of that position now. For me, it's extremely disappointing to see someone that knows exactly what they're doing do something so dangerous, so heinous, really. The fact that's disappointing to me is that this is someone that's of the same species that I am.
Yeah. Well, and someone, and I think this has been, really part of the whole narrative in the last several years is that the progressive, or what we might, term the left in this country, is now just following sheepishly leadership that is pro-war and leadership that buys into the basics of the neoliberal economic argument, and they're going right along with it. It's very much like the Tea Party went along with hating Obamacare.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly that. It's I have to qualify everything because the terminology doesn't. It's been so bastardized. You have these cults basically around that constitute the electorate for particularly the Democratic Party, but also the Republican Party, and even some of the other parties, including the Greens. There's some, aspects of that where it's high school colors, or football team allegiance or something. Whatever comes down from on high for the group, everyone has on their lips that day, no matter the logical contradictions between what's on your lips today and what was on your lips yesterday. Even if it makes your mouth look like that, because it's such a contortion from yesterday, just in terms of physical manifestation of it. People by the millions. I mean, you can look on any Facebook conversation. I'm looking at with Trump yesterday, the last couple days. It comes out. He wants to pull out. He declares he's pulling out of Syria. He declares victory over ISIS in Syria, and it's coming out. Now, people can get into an argument over whose victory. The victory there is the Syrian government, Syrian people, with the assistance of Russia's air force and military, Iran, Hezbollah, and some others. You could also take the position that Trump does have a victory here. His battle wasn't with ISIS. His battle was with the Pentagon and Langley. And if he succeeds in pulling out of the war in Syria, that's the adversary that he vanquished in order to accomplish it. Regardless of what all of that stuff is, the thing to me that's of the highest value, because it stands on its own, is the reaction of people to the announcement, particularly people that call themselves of the left, the resistance. If Trump is thinking of or actually intending to pull the U.S. out of Syria and do the same in Afghanistan, for example, to me, it seems the anti-war movement, people who are against war, people who would like to put an end to empire, all of that, have either a strategic or a tactical alliance with him on that point from the get-go. To make it actualize it, make it happen, and to move it around. Even if you don't give a good golly gee willikers about supporting Trump politically or not, anyone else in the political world now or coming up that is thinking about taking on the establishment and making peace as policy has to know that there's a constituency that will support them to the death if they try it, rather than fold and say, what's the difference?
Well, you mean the real problem to me, as I see it, and I've had a few discussions on this point, is that we're not, we're not really talking about policy anymore. We're not really talking about being anti-war or, pro-healthcare or whatever. We're talking about teams.
Right.
If the blue team does it, it's
Right.
great. If the red
Right.
team does it, it sucks. It really doesn't matter what is.
Right.
I mean, and
That's
I
right.
always say that the bipartisan stuff is the worst. If they agree on something, you're going to get, you're in trouble.
That's
Uh,
right.
but
Both sides are feasting enough to keep them quiet, and you're the host. Who's this good news for?
yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, I think a lot of this. I mean, a lot of what I'm hearing about the Syria pullout has to do with the big gift it is to Vladimir
Right.
Putin,
Right. Yeah.
and this kind of falls right in, really on the heels of the uh, revelations from the Senate, or from two private corporations hired by the Senate to
Right.
investigate the so-called Russian interference in social media. First thing that strikes me here, and I assume you've looked at some of these things too,
Yeah.
is the scale. The Oxford report, which is one of the two reports, says that the total ad spend on Facebook by the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg was approximately $73,711.
Okay. Now, let me scale that for you. Okay.
Yes, please.
I'm in Ossining, New York, in Westchester County. It's the northern part of Westchester County. Ossining is a village inside of a town, total population about 34,000, 35,000 people. There's about 5 or 6 other municipalities of about the same size. In my uh, segment of the zone for the cable company Optimum here, that when you do ad buys, this is an ad buy. It's Ossining, Peekskill, Croton, Briarcliff, Chappaqua, Mount Kisco, Bedford, like that. So you buy. I have a gas station, and I make a TV spot for my gas station. Then I go buy ads. The budgets for a business like a contractor that does drywall work
Mhm.
in a zone like mine, like the northwest quadrant of Westchester County, might be $50,000 to $100,000 in a year for ad buys. This is what Russia spent supposedly against a $1.2 billion war chest, plus 24/7 media out, totally out for. I mean, you've got them kissing Clinton's behind on the one hand on 3 channels at this moment, while they're interviewing the kid that sat behind Trump in kindergarten and said he used to break wind. Okay, this is all of that lined up, and you're spending as much as like the muffler shop up the road does on TV ads.
Right.
The scale is that absurd.
Yes, the other thing that got me was that the total number of Facebook posts was 2,442 for the entire 2016, which amounts to 6 or 7 posts a day. And I have
half of them
several
are
Facebook
mine.
friends who post that much.
Yeah, mine. They might be mine.
Well, it could be.
I might have been the entire effort. Wow, somebody owes me a check, brother.
Yeah, the other one that I really felt was quite funny was that they showed 81 unique Facebook pages. Where businesses have pages, and I'm sure you have a page probably for your radio show.
Yeah.
I do as well. And 33 of those pages had over 1,000 followers.
Right.
And there are 50 million business pages alone on Facebook, and that's not really counting non-business pages.
Yeah.
My favorite on the followers was to note that somebody's had over 1,000 followers. Mr. Bean has over 81 million followers.
Okay, there you go.
And I
Okay.
think so. He's got obviously a great deal more effect on our elections than the Russians.
Yeah. Hey, not for nothing, by the way. I mean, if they want to point to Russian influence, they should be looking at the fact that RT's YouTube page has more hits than any other news organization in the
Right.
English language, and it isn't because they advertise, and it isn't because they've wormed their way into people, by using hackers or whatever. It's
No.
because they draw the audience. If I'm CNN or Fox or MSNBC or or whomever, and choking on overhead and trying to figure out how to stay in business, I'd be looking at the business model.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd be looking at what is it exactly that's drawing audience to these people. Oh, I know. They don't talk to the people like they're morons. And they actually cover some news once in a while.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one thing that's so striking is just the content. I mean, what you see on U.S. cable networks, you pretty much see the same thing. It doesn't matter if you're on CNN or MSNBC; you're seeing pretty much the same thing 24/7. One show goes into another, and they start again with the same stories.
Yeah.
And Fox does the same thing, although they have a little different slant.
Right.
But RT really actually has news. I mean, they cover events in the world that we don't cover. They hire the commentators and anchors from American TV that were fired because they told the truth too often.
What happened at the UN yesterday? What happened at the State Department yesterday? What happened at the White House press conference yesterday? You might see one snippet about one thing from one of those every couple days. They cover that stuff regularly. Why? This is where the public discussion of these major issues is taking place. Thought you might want to hear some of it.
Yeah. Something other than who gave Michelle Obama candy. Yeah, the other thing that strikes me about this influence campaign, I mean, I don't know whether you got to see the Al Jazeera documentary on the Israel lobby, which was finally released by Electronic Intifada. There are clearly a number of Facebook pages with tremendous hundreds of thousands of followers that are being directed indirectly, in some cases very directly, by the Israeli government and designed to influence the U.S. electorate. And yet we don't hear a thing about that.
That's
That
right.
doesn't get covered at all. Although there's some reports here and there that Mueller might be looking in that direction.
Mueller's going to be wherever he is next year. Starting January 1st, you're going to have the House investigations of.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Trump uses 2-ply and not 3-ply toilet paper, and here we don't know where these tax returns of his from 1974 came from, but here they are, and etc. So it's going to be all Trump all the time. They're going to try to break up that 40 some odd percent, whatever the hell it is, 38 to 51% that he's been holding in the face of a 3-year media campaign, wall to wall against them. They're going to try and break that up. I know that it's not going to break up over what he's doing with the military, and I think actually it's going to set a lot of other things in motion if he's able to see his way through that. Then they've got to have an electoral strategy to remove him. That involves, of course, beating up on him with a process, with corruption and whatever. So continuing the hearings. But now that the House is, in control of the Democrats, it'll come from there. Much is declared at Adam Schiff and Pelosi and the rest of them.
Right. Although, I mean, they just, 2 years ago lost an election, which was basically the entire policy campaign was, Trump is awful and we're better than Trump, and that didn't sell.
They lost it. They lost the midterm too. Really. Yeah. I mean, that the Republicans lost the House, but that's normal, and they lost it by less than usual. Well, certainly historically less than almost every occasion in the post-war period. And they held the Senate, which is unusual. Mm-hmm. So the strategy didn't work. What would be a normal outcome was actually mitigated by something, and certainly the strategy didn't enhance what should have happened in the midterm. That said, they got to come up with some cover, perhaps, for some kind of extrajudicial action, removing him from office in one way or another. And if they do that, he said something the other day that something I've been saying to people for a good long while. But he said, I hate to tell you, my numbers are solid. Okay, those people aren't buying any of the stuff that you're saying. And
Mhm.
if I'm removed from office in a way that looks illegitimate to them, you might have a revolution on your hands. He said essentially that last week.
Mhm.
Now, what I've been trying to say to people, like a lot of kids in their 20s, for example, Antifa, all this, we're going to go kick their butt. It's time for, go in the streets and have a revolution, all this stuff. Out of the groups of people that will go fight an actual war on the streets,
Mhm.
you have with a revolution, who has the guns? Who has the training? Who has the military strategic and tactical training also? It ain't the left.
Well, let's hope that we don't come to that.
Well, the reason I brought it up is that Trump may be right when he says that if they remove him and there's a cloud over the legitimacy of what they do, there may well be that kind of civil war, and that's what the two sides go into the civil war with. One with guns, and one with lawyers and the PTA.
We're sitting here on the winter solstice, and
Yeah.
it'll be a new year in about 10 days. Maybe it's the time to talk about our predictions for 2019 and where do we think things are generally going to go in the world and in the U.S. Your crystal ball working there in New York?
No, it's cracked and full of steam and clouds. But I mean, you have a number of moving parts. You can certainly look at what kind of motion and what kind of collision influence they have on each other. There is this fight in Washington and elsewhere, policies made for the U.S. foreign policy in particular, over the direction and role of the United States. Basically the post-war order from here going forward. The hegemonic model that has been more or less the motivator of American policy since the close of World War II and accelerated at the end of the Cold War, sort of exhausted itself. And there are, serious economic and other power centers presenting on the world stage. And it's actually natural and healthy that this is what's happening. There's I think, on this side of it, institutionally, an ambiguity on the question of whether this is desirable or not. There are many entrenched interests that hold on to the idea that they can have and achieve global hegemony, and that is a goal to be pursued to the exclusion of all else, maintaining the right to change governments at anywhere, anytime that they deem fit, regime change, nation building, etc., pushing right up to Russia's borders and China's borders and doing war games and provoking them and attempting regime change in those countries and risking global war, etc. And it means if they can win, then managing the world, under that model. There are a lot of folks in the world, I would say just about everybody, but the people who would benefit from this, that think that that's a lousy model for human evolution and development, and are prepared to fight and are fighting, to stop it from happening. So I think that there's a manifestation of that in the U.S. government, with Trump on the side of the rising, or whatever he represents, but the sort of the insurgent there, and the bulk of institutional power trying to maintain the old model. And we've been seeing like a struggle over that in the language of many other struggles, but really over that. Um, and it looks like there's a turning point, coming now because Trump seems to be, after the midterm elections, pivoting and saying, okay, fine, I promised people there was going to be an end to this regime change and, these invasions and endless war and all that. I'm going to start pursuing it. And he positioned himself really well to do it. The rhetoric at Korea before the deal in Korea, the rhetoric with Iran and the withdrawal from the JCPOA and all of that, assuming that follows that track, which I do. All of these different things, he's positioned well to protect himself from attack from the right, but to deliver, if that's what he wants to do. And I think even if he's pretending to do it, the reason he's pretending to do it is he knows and he's measured that there's a powerful latent constituency for that exists.
Right.
That thing is what we ought to be paying attention to. That is our, coming anti-war movement. That is our coming revolution. That is where change is going to come from. And he sees it. Now, whether he intends to opportunistically try to ride it, manage it, whatever, it's irrelevant. He would never have been elected or been able to maintain his position in the face of everything if there wasn't that constituency there. And I don't necessarily think that it conforms person to person to that 38 to 51% Trump support that polls. I think it's something else, and it's over policy.
To me, it seems that there is a big constituency in this country that wants change, that wants serious systemic change, that wants the government to do something for the people. Now, they may differ rather widely on what the government ought to do or not to do, and they might differ on a lot of tactical methods for achieving it.
Right.
But there's a clear consensus out there of people wanting change. The Democrats have unfortunately positioned themselves as the party of the status quo. That is not a winning strategy. And if you're going to suggest change, then you need to provide big change, and you need to articulate what that change would be to some extent, because Trump, he is trying to do the things that he promised his voters he would do, whether good or bad. He promised them that, and he wants to try to carry it out. That's kind of unusual. We didn't see that with our recent Democratic presidents, for sure.
When he was in the Republican primaries, that's the reason that it didn't matter if Reince Priebus or any of these other characters said, forget Trump, he's not a Republican. Because the policies of both, parties, they didn't build constituencies with their party, with their own policies. They relied on the other party to build their constituency by being so bad and identified with so much of the pain that people were suffering that they would vote for anybody that wasn't them. That would be us.
The big problem with that, as we found out, was that if you don't then deliver, then there's only two choices on the ballot, and they'll go to the other choice, no matter if it's distasteful.
Going into 2016, a lot of the interviews I was doing from foreign media, they assumed it was going to be Bush and Clinton. Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton. Now, how do you go to a population that's suffering by every measure and offer them one or the other retreads when they're looking for change? That's how you get Sanders and Trump in the first place.
We'll have to end it there. If you have comments or questions about what you've heard, email me at widerviewradio@gmail.com or comment on our Facebook page at Widerview Radio. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening.